Well, welcome back to As the Res Turns. I'm going to do a series of videos. To really get into it all in one video would be an awful long video. So I'm going to do a series of videos touching on some very important but kind of new area of understanding of things. It relates to the City of Port Alberni and the proposed Harbourview Key Development Project that they just approved a draft RIP on. And it's in the context of UNDRIP, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and the City of Port Alberni and Tseshaht First Nation's protocol agreement that they signed. And so I'll run through this quick overview here in part one, and I'll get a little bit more in depth into UNDRIP and the TRC and some of these issues in subsequent videos that I'll be making. But I wanted to make, I think this is very important for this first part. So on February 14th, the City of Port Alberni issued on their Facebook page a public input into the Port Alberni's Harbourview Key lands for sale. And they were requesting input from the community about what to do with the sale of that land. And evidently this had been up previously in 2006, 2004, and again in 2016. And they brought it up again. There's been a lot of legal changes and a lot of development since then in relationships between the city and First Nations, and a changing demographic within the community itself. It's my understanding that in 2013 that it was the RFP was put out and eventually was abandoned. I know at that time there was a lot of people in Port Alberni that supported leaving that treat area as a forested area, and my initial interest in it was as a grandfather to our grandchildren that are Tseshaht. That is the last untorched, undeveloped, unpaved, unexcavated piece of land that's adjacent to the original village site there. And I absolutely think it's important for our grandchildren to be able to go there and touch that same ground that their ancestors walked on. They have a right for that continuity of connection to their ancestors there. And that's my initial interest in it, and to this point in time, I am not representing Tseshaht First Nation. I'm speaking as a grandfather. But I also know these issues here we're facing in Port Alberni are going to be faced in many communities, and in the future here, as we move into this new era of decolonization, and how do we implement UNDRIP and the TRC into communities and protocol agreements. So this raises up the questions I want to touch on in this series. What are the roles and responsibilities of the City of Port Alberni in First Nations consultation or engagement regarding the proposed Harbourview land sale request for proposals? Have these roles and responsibilities been met by the City of Port Alberni? And what remedies exist if the city does not meet their roles and responsibilities? And I think this is part of what we're going to get into in any situation like this, but it's particularly critical on this one because they are moving it forward. And I don't want to see this get past the point of no return before we correct the flaws that exist. So in the January 14th meeting of City Council 2019, there's a packet in there for approval. There's a protocol agreement between the Tseshaht First Nation and the City of Port Alberni. I haven't seen a signed copy of this. There was a media article on January 29th, I think it was, in the Alberni Valley News, saying that there was a meeting between the two councils to sign this, but I cannot find a signed copy of this agreement on the city website or Tseshaht First Nation website, which is bothersome because it is impossible to have reconciliation between two communities if the agreements between the two communities aren't readily accessible to the communities themselves, but particularly to the First Nations communities, because there is the need for free, prior, informed consent of the rights and title holders, which is the people. It's not the political bodies. They do not hold the rights. They represent the people, but it's the people that actually hold the rights. But in this agreement, it's pretty well seen down there in section C. The parties recognize the following documents and principles as guides to effective intergovernmental relations: United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. There's the location, United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's The document I'm citing is actually on the United Nations website itself. Here's a part of the preamble, is that they're convinced that the control of indigenous peoples over developments affecting them and their lands and territories and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, culture, and traditions, and promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. It recognizes respect for indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices, contributes to sustainable, equitable development, and proper management of the environment. Let's remember at that site there's an eagle nest. We also need green spaces for ecological purposes. Does this apply to municipal level governments? It says recognizing the situation of indigenous peoples varies from region to region and from country to country, and that the significance of national and regional particularities in various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration. The impacts happen locally, just like this situation here. It is the impacts of city councils and school boards and forest companies. These things happen locally. So even though this is an international document, it does apply locally. And further to that, the City Council of Port Alberni did adopt UNDRIP through resolution, unanimous resolution of the City Council to operate under the City Council, and further reinforce that by signing an agreement with Tseshaht First Nation that UNDRIP would be implemented. Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's conducted in Canada, which the city also agreed with Tseshaht that they would follow. Under reconciliation, the Canadian government and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. Now again, the City Council last year voted to adopt that, unanimous vote by City Council, and they further ratified it when they signed an agreement with the Tseshaht First Nation, specifically referencing all their reconciliations calls for action, which includes the municipal government. It's not just a federal level responsibility. Calls to action number 92. We call on the corporate sector in Canada to adopt UNDRIP as a reconciliation framework. Now, underneath that subsection I, commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Now that's important there. Commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Now it's very clear that the Harbourview project isn't considered an economic development project. In the City Council meeting that was held on May 13th this week, when they approved proceeding with it, the Economic Development Office stood up, and then they were talking about it being directly on the shoulders of the Economic Development Office. So it is an economic development project that requires informed consent, prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding. And that is where we're at now. So now we'll start asking the question, did that occur? So the next clip I'm going to show is a City Council member asking the CAO of the City of Port Alberni what consultation occurred before the RPF phase came back before Council.
Council, questions, comments? Councilor Geiger?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have two questions. First of all, what was the process for the First Nations consultation in this project? Were they consulted on this RFP at all?
Madam Mayor, so just a sort of a definition, I guess, municipal government does not have an obligation to consult, Big C consult with the First Nation, as does a federal government or a provincial government. So we like to use the term engage. So so on some matters, the city engages with one or both First Nations. On this topic, on this land, we didn't see it as a First Nations engagement matter. But we did have conversations with Tseshaht First Nation because previously they had expressed an interest in that property. And during that conversation, we had assured them that we would not proceed without having a conversation with them. So we had a conversation with Tseshaht about this, not because we needed to consult or engage, but because they had asked about it previously.
Thank you.
Now, as we can see from the clip of the city council, at the same time that was being discussed at city council, the same afternoon that Tseshaht chief counselor released this in the Tseshaht Band Bulletin. I guess a world of synchronicity, it happened at the same time. So where the city says they had no obligation, CAO, to engage or consult, that it was just a conversation's all, and it's my point of view, after that point, the city council had been given false information. Not only had, if that was the approach of the city from the very beginning, that they had no obligation or responsibilities to consult or engage, and then told the city council that, well, then any input from Tseshaht, in whatever form it took, was their city council was told you can ignore it because we don't even have an obligation to even really discuss it with them. So that makes the entire process tainted. It makes that vote tainted. It also makes the agreement invalid. The whole process that the city and UNDRIP and the TRC recommendations said needed to be followed. Now, the Tseshaht chief counselor says in her document here, the city has ensured us that the treat areas will be removed from the proposed development. Now, it's clear that RFP, the discussion from the city, ended up being included in the treat area because it didn't matter what Tseshaht said, and that the Tseshaht First Nation will have a chance to review any proposals before the city council goes through the selection process. Now, it's very clear from the discussions and the motions made that they did not consider Tseshaht to have any standing at all. There was no recognition of any Tseshaht interest, no reconciliation interest, no recognition of having to follow any of these guidelines or agreements that the city made. All these are completely overridden, but not even being considered valid or relevant according to the CAO or the discussions that took place and it was ultimately voted on. I do thank the city councilor for bringing it up and for Mayor Minions for making a motion to exclude the treat area, but in the end it was included over what Tseshaht's understanding is. So now what? What happens when we get to a point where First Nations engage with these agreements and processes? The city denies that they even had an obligation to even speak to the First Nation. What do we do now before it gets pushed to a point of no return? Back to the United Nations, Article 40. Back to UNDRIP. The indigenous peoples have a right to access and prompt decision making through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes. Now the question at this point comes into me is that they have a clearly signed an agreement with Tseshaht that includes UNDRIP and TRC. The City Council did that also through a motion to City Council that they endorsed last year. They made a decision based upon saying that none of these things even existed, that they had no obligation under any of these articles that they themselves voted on and signed an agreement to follow. There was a clear difference of interpretation between the Tseshaht Chief Counselor and the city on what Tseshaht's interest there was, and also what the outcome of that consultation would be. When there was a clear difference between what the understandings of the parties was, as can be seen from what the city was told by the CAO when they voted on their motion for the RFP, and what Tseshaht Chief Counselor put in her Chief Counselor report, then we had to go back to this protocol agreement that the city signed. Implementation and dispute resolution about the protocol agreement. It says specifically in there that it'd be administered but implemented, and it doesn't say just talked about, it says implemented. You know, that's not just a conversation, it's implemented through the CAO and the city and the executive director. In the event a dispute arises, the CAO shall meet to seek a resolution. That occurred. I believe the CAO met with the Tseshaht Chief Counselor and the Mayor Minions when they went out there on their on-site visit. If the administration of both parties cannot resolve any dispute as referenced above, the Mayor of the city and the Chief Counselor of Tseshaht First Nation shall meet to develop solutions. Now they did. They went out on an on-site visit. They discussed it. The solution that was arrived at was to exclude the treat area from inclusion in the RFP. It would remain underneath the city control and designated as a heritage area, as a heritage site or park in the next official community plan. And that was agreed upon as a solution. It would also include Tseshaht having significant input into the actual development of the RFP and into the selection process of the RFP. So that was the proposed agreement. Now, that was brought back to City Council, and clearly that was rejected because the city was told point blank that there was no obligation of the city to Tseshaht, that Tseshaht did not have any interest that the city recognized, and that they just had a conversation, but they weren't even required to even have any responsibility to even have a conversation. You know, so that clearly rejected this protocol agreement that the city had signed with Tseshaht. So now at that point in time, the remedy was not just to go ahead and vote as if Tseshaht does not even exist. And it wasn't to just go ahead and vote and say, well, we'll work that out with the developer. The remedy at that point is to go back to the foundational documents, the UNDRIP and TRC, and to this accord that the City Council signed with Tseshaht, and look at guidance in there, see if there's a guidance that exists in policy, because this is effectively a policy of the city now. So if the dispute cannot be resolved at the levels of administration or mayor and chief and councilor, which it clearly isn't, if you see the difference between the chief councilor's report and what the CAO informed council, then a meeting of both councils shall occur to resolve the matter in accordance with this accord. It doesn't say just go ahead and vote and do what you were going to do anyway. That's not what that says. There is a specific next step there. At that point in that city council meeting, when the solution proposed by Tseshaht was going to be rejected, that should have stopped the proceedings, fall back to this policy, and taken the next step in the process. Otherwise, projects continue to get pushed past the point of no return. We don't do anything to implement any of these UNDRIP or the TRC or this protocol, and we just continue to be forced into making the same decisions in the same way that continues to repeat the same mistakes of the past. And their compounding errors is not a sound decision-making process. And it certainly doesn't recognize the free, prior, informed consent of the Tseshaht people, because none of this has been brought to the people. So, we need to slow down. Let's get this right. There is no rush to do something so fast that we just throw all these documents away and make the city council's votes from implementing UNDRIP and the TRC and signing these protocol agreements. If they're just going to mean nothing, then why did we do it? If they just mean nothing, what's this about? We can do better than that, and we have to. In the next videos, I'm going to get a little bit deeper into the actual substance of the UNDRIP and TRCs, and where these also apply to other policy issues involving situations here, particularly this RFP. But I wanted to put this video out now so that people can see the situation, and that there is a role and responsibility of the city, and there are steps to resolve this already in place, and that the city should rescind the motion that they passed. And let's get all back on the same page with the framework and guidelines of decision making that everyone agreed to do. Anyway, thank you very much, and I look forward to this next series of videos.